oh, we have to compete with the Japanese, we have to compete with the Germans. See, that whole model of the nation states competing with each other is also driving us to this breakdown thing, because now the Cold War's over and it's not going to be a competition, we hope, anymore with weapons. We realize that the two superpowers destroyed each other's economies and Japan won the Cold War.
Welcome to Worth Quoting, an interview program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. Today's program is very interesting. We have two very special guests with us, two women who have unusual points of view that I think are going to make a difference for the future of the Earth. And with us today is Elisabet Sahtouris, who is a biologist, and Hazel Henderson, who is a green economist. Both of them are futurists, and both of them are going to be talking about the future in a new way. Elisabet, I was very interested in this book that you have written. It's called Gaia, The Human Journey from Chaos to Cosmos. And it starts with a totally different premise than anything I'm used to, which is a look at the natural instead of the mechanical universe. Can you tell us how you got there?
Well, we've all grown up in a society that uses mechanical images. We're familiar with talking about the heart as a pump and the brain as a computer, and all of society as a well-oiled machine, or that it should be a well-oiled machine, that there is such a perfect social model. And even the laws of nature that physicists have given us are based on mechanical devices such as the Carnot cycle and the steam engine. Well, when I was in graduate school, the greatest sin one could commit was anthropomorphism.
Which is?
And that meant projecting human qualities onto nature. And I kept thinking about the fact that we were using mechanical models to describe nature, and that was really mechanomorphism, which you had to talk about in order to get good grades and get a degree. Now, mechanomorphism, it seemed to me, was a kind of second-hand anthropomorphism, because machines are the inventions of humans, which are one species on one planet among many others. So why should our machinery become the basic model for the whole universe and for all of nature? Well, Western science is arranged that way. These models came out of the early Industrial Revolution and the Newton's clockwork universe and so forth. But I decided to try to look at those people who were more interested in seeing the world in organic models, living models, the world as a living system. That's what drew me to Jim Lovelock's work on with the Gaia hypothesis, which I prefer to call a Gaia concept, to conceptualize the Earth as a living system rather than a mechanical system. Now, by the old definitions that most people learned in biology, it doesn't work very well, because such features as growth and reproduction were part of the definition of life. But those definitions are changing too, and leading biologists such as Varela and Maturana, who came out of Chile and then went to MIT and the University of Paris, use a definition of life which is autopoiesis, good old Greek word, meaning self-creation. And the definition is quite simple. A living system is any system that constantly creates its own parts. Growth and reproduction may be later byproducts, but that's the fundamental definition. And the Earth fits that definition. It constantly creates its own parts. If we have time, we can get into that.
Okay.
But looking at the human species as a biologist within the context of a complete global living system makes you see human behavior very differently. And Hazel here and I met because her economics were economics that fit a living system. And that really drew me to her work.
And that's very different from any other point of view, probably, too.
Very much so. And I grew up in England and in a country area, and was always in love with nature. And I felt that I had a pretty good idea about how nature worked. And then I encountered economics as it's being taught today. And it's amazing that economics, of course, picked up this same mechanistic model. The economists sort of see the economy as a well-oiled machine, and sometimes they look at the economy kind of as if it's a big bathtub, you know, a hydraulic system, and oh my gosh, if the economy's going down, we have to open up the spigot and open up the money supply, and if you've got inflation, you have to pull the plug out so that some of it drains out, you know.
And the old Freudian mind system.
And in a sense, the thing that so struck me about economic models, and I'm talking about all economists from left to right, from socialist economists and Marxist economists to classical Western market economists, all economic theory ignored nature. I mean, in other words, nature was free, was always going to be there, was always going to be available, there would always be enough forests to chop down, there would always be enough oil to dig up out of the ground. And in these economic models, there was no such thing as scarcity, you know, that we would never run out of room to throw things away. And there was absolutely no concern, really, for how the planet how I thought the planet operated. So that was what drew me into studying economics and trying to figure out.
With the clean air movement, which is, everybody knows that the air is free, or at least think so, and now I don't think people are assuming that anymore, looking at the devastation that's been done lots of places.
That's right. I mean, not only that, but I mean, if you look at the extent to which that economic model took us, not only did it pollute the air in Jacksonville and every other major metropolitan area in the world, but it's polluting the whole planetary atmosphere. We're loading it with carbon dioxide, and you know, nobody's quite sure at what time we're going to run into a global warming, but at some time we will. And at the same time, all of the chlorofluorocarbons, you know, in the cans of hairspray are destroying the ozone layer. And all of that was assumed away, and this same anthropomorphic, this human-centered idea was very strong in economics. You know, that there was no consideration of anything else other than there's human beings and whatever they want to do. And of course, human beings are very important, but if they don't understand that they live in a symbiotic relationship, in cooperative relationship with forests and other species, we're all in trouble.
Is that what brought you two together? Is this
Yes,
shared philosophy?
Yes, it certainly was. When I was off on a Greek island writing that book and was looking at how can our species relate to other species and what kinds of politics and economics would be appropriate for us, it always came back to living systems, the way living systems organize themselves. And I thought of simple, homely little examples, often in relation to my own body, because that's the most familiar living system we all have. So I started to think, what if international economics, for instance, were carried out in our bodies? It would be something like this. You have blood cells that are developed within the bones all over the body, and then they're swept up to these northern industrial organs, the heart and lung system here, and the blood's purified, you add oxygen, it's now a useful product, and the heart distribution center would make an announcement. The body price for blood is so much today. Who wants? And then you ship the blood to the organs that can afford the blood, and you throw the rest out as surplus. Well, you see, even a child can see that that kind of economics doesn't fit in this living system. And yet you understand why the newspapers can give you a crisis of overproduction at the same time as it's talking about starvation in Ethiopia or Bangladesh or somewhere.
We are a species that really has spread over the entire planet. We're the only species now which has the fate of the planet, in a sense, in our hands. And as I looked at the university curriculum many years ago, I realized that they had reality all chopped up into these little boxes, you know, marked engineering and economics and biology and thermodynamics and all of the literature and all of the rest of it. And these poor students, you know, would be kind of wandering around, and there was no unifying principle. And I found, you know, that as I would go and give lectures on campuses, the students would say, well, you know, what are we going to do about this education? We can't make head or tail of it, you know, because they were the generation that grew up seeing seeing the planet from space. They saw those pictures, and there was nothing in the curriculum that really drew all that back together. And I used to always say to them, well, you know, I really think that universities, many universities all over the world are now kind of museums of this old mechanistic culture and this fragmented viewpoint, and that I honor museums. I mean, I go to them all the time, but I wouldn't want to check myself into one for 4 years, you know, and just have nothing but this kind of micro fragmented view of the world. And I have found in the past 3 or 4 years that I have done more lectures on campuses at the invitation of academic vice presidents, and say on the subject of how do we globalize the curriculum? How do we pull it all together?
And that's not just cultural globalization. It means much more than that.
It means looking at the planet as a living system. And one of the resources that I find is very useful is the one produced by NASA with all of these fabulous photographs called Earth System Science. Brings the whole thing together. And the problem is that it's all interdisciplinary. And you know how the universities are, all the professors to protect their turf, and when the budget cut comes, what gets cut first? The interdisciplinary programs, you know, environmental sciences are always interdisciplinary. All of those things are the ones that get cut. So we have a long way to go in actually changing the way we teach our children. So it's going to take a decade.
Well, it sounds to me like also within a field, within a discipline of biology, there needs to be some changes too, and it's hard to believe that we'd be teaching biology with this mechanism idea as opposed to the natural system, which we should be more comfortable with.
Well, if I were in charge, of course, biology would become the fundamental science, because once you see the Earth as a living system, and you see that the mechanical models, which focus on breakdown, by the way, while living systems, when they're in crisis, can reconstitute themselves, can revive themselves, often in new ways. And we need a kind of overarching concept for our education. We're at a time now when humans are going to make or break their own species' life on this planet. And nothing is more important than talking about our relationship to the environment. Do our economics fit it, a living system? Do our politics fit it? That environmental literacy, if you like, has to be the focus, under the umbrella of which all the other things come into place. Now, I talked about focus and umbrella at once. That's because I'm used to thinking in terms of overarching concepts and details within the same model. And as Hazel said, that economic models have been very incomplete. They haven't looked at where things are coming from and where things are going. A living system only functions by taking in, holding matter in a form, constantly changing its own parts, as we said before, and then letting that matter out. But it must interact with other living systems, which on this planet are arranged so that one man's waste is another man's food. And that we haven't taken into account. So we've gone into a species bloom, using up resources like mad, polluting what's left, and not seeing ourselves at all in this context.
Yes, I mean, the whole idea I love to throw out sometimes is that sort of, in a way, plants invented humans to be their waste disposal cans, you know, because they produce oxygen and we have to have it. But look at the lovely cooperation, because we exhale a carbon dioxide and they need that. And to me, it's all of those kind of concepts of reciprocity that economics lost. And, you know, the whole thing got modeled on Darwin and the survival of the fittest, you know, and competition and all of this, whereas we know human beings are just as cooperative as they are competitive. And if you look at any natural species, there's as much cooperation going on within the species, between the species, as there is competition. And competition is wonderful. If we didn't have the competition competition where good ideas could drive out silly ideas and where better inventions could take the place of older things. You know, we do need competition, but we need that balance with cooperation, which if we looked at nature, we would see is what goes on.
But economics is very different to me in the sense that it makes it an uneven playing field. I mean, you give more, if you talk about taxes, you give more weight to something. You make things happen as opposed to a natural balance. You've made it unnatural, haven't you?
Well, the economic, yes, today, I mean, when you look at the way the presidential campaigns are being conducted generally in the last 25 years, particularly the last decade, oh, we have to compete with the Japanese, we have to compete with the Germans. See, that whole model of the nation states competing with each other is also driving us to this breakdown thing, because now the Cold War's over and it's not going to be a competition, we hope, anymore with weapons. We realize that the two superpowers destroyed each other's economies and Japan won the Cold War. You know, and so we realized that we can't go on doing that kind of thing. So what we now have is kind of economic competition to the death sort of thing. And yet you can't run a planet like that either, because not every country in the world can run an export surplus. It's clear on the face of it, isn't it? Somebody's got to lose. That's a win-lose game. And so what we're looking for here is the kind of thing where we look, and luckily the American people are beginning to realize this. Survey research shows that they're beginning to see that the only way you can, quote, level the global playing field is not by fighting each other to the death and leveling all the rainforests and leveling people's cultures so that we all have to, you know, speak the same language and stuff like that, but to level the global playing field upward by putting girder work of international agreements, so that we have international agreements about protecting the ozone layer, international agreements about protecting the oceans, international agreements about worker safety, international agreements about consumer protection. And bit by bit, that global playing field is being leveled upward, but it's a long learning process.
But part of that is the concept that I think you've really talked about so beautifully, which is looking at the world as a whole, the Earth as a whole, this Gaia idea. And maybe you could talk a little bit about where that came from, because I don't think people think about that way.
Well, the things that attracted me to Hazel, you see, was that she was using a whole other way of measuring economies, measuring human societies, and they fit more into the living system model so much better, because we're not only based on a mechanical worldview, but on a set of values that is extremely materialistic. It was honestly believed that human technology would solve all human problems. And as it turns out, it doesn't. And why doesn't it? We're looking now not only at how many machines can we produce, how much technology can we create, but what's the quality of life under this system, not only for us, but around the whole globe. And we've recognized that the industrial societies can't go on with this mad consumption, that we have to think of the other areas of a living system's life, the quality not only of our lives in technological terms, but air, water, soil. Is it appropriate to apply industrial designs to agriculture, separating plants and animals and using all these artificial means? In fact, we're killing our soils at such a rate that from a biologist's point of view, we may well go extinct within a matter of decades. So again, I say it's the most important thing, but it's not just shifting from the mechanical to the organic paradigm. It's looking at the values associated with those two paradigms, and your country futures indicators.
Well, I think that we ought to just talk about the word paradigm, because it's kind of getting very fashionable. I mean, George Bush uses it in his speeches, and it is the title, I use in the title of my new book, you know, it's Paradigms in Progress. And I like to just think of a paradigm really as a pair of spectacles, a certain pair of spectacles with a certain color. that you put on to look at the world, and they show you a different pattern than you could see with the old pair of spectacles. And so that's really all it is, kind of a worldview. And in a sense, really, that's all I was doing with the country futures indicators. And this is a new scorecard that countries could use, which would redefine wealth and redefine progress. And I mean, that is like a tall order. And yet economists defined wealth as money, accumulating money. And yet, even if you go back to the early economists, they always were very clear that money was only a tracking system. It was just an information system that measured the exchanges of human resourcefulness and human energy and the exchanges with the natural world, the resources. And money in and of itself has no value at all. Money is just worthless green pieces of paper unless there's trust, unless you accept it. I mean, you know, that's all banking is based on. If we all decide that we don't believe in money and we line up outside the bank, sure enough, we'll break the bank if enough people decide to pull the money out. So what has to happen right now is that we have to go back to the real world, and instead of quantifying the progress of nations by whether the gross national product goes up, which is all just quantified on per capita cash income, we have to look at results. Hey, what happened in the real world? Is the water that people drink getting purer? Is the air that they breathe safe or unsafe? What is the infant mortality rate? What are the literacy rates? What are the crime rates? Do people feel safe walking on the streets? All that is just as important.
How many resources does the country still have?
I mean, the biodiversity, you know, the diversity of species. Are we cutting down forests at an unsustainable rate? All of those things are real world criteria. And the interesting thing is that even the income per capita, which is what gross national product uses, is now finally, because all these currencies are bouncing around every day, and you can't even tell very well what people's standard of living is from the currency, because it might be just that the currency's value too high. So even there, we go back to a time measure, and we say, how many hours does a Russian have to work to buy a loaf of bread versus how many hours does a Japanese have to work to buy a bowl of rice? And so it's kind of this kind of new measure would make politicians actually accountable, so that if a president says, hey, I'm the education president, we'd be able to say, let's watch the literacy rate. What happened? And so, you know, it brings people back into this kind of real-world discussion of what is quality of life. And of course, incidentally, Carol, we ought to remember here that Jacksonville, Florida is absolutely on the forefront.
That's true.
With the quality of life indicators. Why don't you tell us?
For 10 years, Jacksonville has been doing some work on the quality of life indicators, and it was a citizens group, the Jacksonville Community Council Incorporated, JCCI, who put together a very large group of people to do some research on what's important and what can you measure. Sometimes what's important you can't measure. So there were some compromises there, but they came up with 79 indicators for the quality of life. And you can't just combine them all and say, you know, this quality of life is an A, B, or C. You have to look at them on an individual level, both this big view that you're talking about and the pattern and the focus. And so that has been a very helpful thing. It's not necessarily all good news, but part of the decision making was, you know, the indicator, if it goes up, you've got to know if that's good or bad. And that's a thinking through process that people have not been used to. So this year, the major thing was setting those targets, because some people say, well, you know, what is the goal here? Do we have a goal? We're kind of goal-driven anyway. You know, what is the literacy rate going to be? What is the graduation rate going to be? And that kind of thing. So another citizen groups were put together among these 9 major areas with different goals underneath them. We scrapped some, we made some new ones up, and we revised some, so that we could have a much better way of looking at the quality of life in Jacksonville. And so we've set some of these goals that we're going to look at in the year 2000. So the process was called Targets 2000, and that way, we'd love for more cities to be able to do that, so we could have some comparative data.
Yes, well, you know, as I go around the world, I take that Jacksonville model and kind of wave it around in my talks. And I know that the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce has had inquiries from the city of Auckland, New Zealand, for example, Anchorage, Alaska, all kinds of places, where they say, hey, hey, this is a no-brainer. Why didn't we do this before? And somehow it was this kind of, I think, this fragmented worldview, to go back to that came out of the Industrial Revolution, the idea from Descartes, you know, that you could understand a system by cutting it up and understanding its parts, but then nobody knew how to integrate it back together again. And suddenly, you know, this is beginning to make sense to people. I mean, this, whether we call it biopolitics and bioeconomics or whatever we call it, it's the reintegration of all of this, and people saying, hey, you know, why should I let one single discipline, economics, decide all of these realities? You know, we let the economists go in the back room and they are going to weight all of these things and tell us whether they think clean air is more important than life expectancy or illiteracy.
Price, they don't value it at all.
They don't value it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a real problem, and I don't know how that fits with what you're talking about in the biological sphere.
It's about systems. It's about the principle of mutual consistency, which says there is no fundamental particle in the universe. There are a lot of self-creating things going on all at once, and they all define each other. So that you can't have these old hierarchies. I like Kustler's term holarchy much better. It's kind of an onion skin layered notion that every living system is embedded in layers of other systems. And that, for instance, going back to a body model again, your cells each must look out for themselves, but also for the whole. And every cell has the whole DNA program in it, doesn't it? We have to look at total systems and not try to have any one part govern the rest and tell it what to do.
And this is why these old notions, the old mechanistic notions of world government, you know, that somehow we would have this thing from the top down, you know, cannot work that way. What is happening is there is an organic kind of model growing up from citizens' organizations, like Friends of the Earth around the world, like Amnesty International around the world, like scientific and professional societies that get together across countries. And they're saying, okay, in this dimension we need these kind of rules and agreements. And then, I mean, you know, if we look at some of the ways that we are building sensible ways of operating in this world, you can look, for example, at the global postal system. I mean, now, there's a global system where you can put a letter in the mail almost anywhere in the world with a reasonable assurance it's going to get to where it's going. It isn't oppressing anybody. It's operated out of a little house in Switzerland somewhere, you know. Or you could look at the global airline system. All the tickets are the same. There's agreements about global, you know, about the traffic controllers training. So it's this kind of coming up from the experience that we're having, rather than some guy has a blueprint, you know, for how we're going to govern the world.
So are the people catching on, or are the governments catching on that this is the way to go?
The people are ahead of the governments, I think. I mean, you know, this is why politicians sound so silly. In almost every country in the world. It's not just our politicians in the US that often sound silly. They sound silly everywhere because they're promising the voters things based on faulty, fragmented logic, that they don't actually understand the system that they're trying to manage.
And is it understandable?
I think it's much more understandable if you look at the whole planet as a living system and humans within that context. It's much more comprehensible to me that way.
That's very good. I know we have a lot more to say on this subject, but it's been a very interesting conversation with both Elisabet Sahtouris and Hazel Henderson, our futurists. Thank you for being with us.